My name is Malcolm Butler. I'm the Dean of Science here at Carleton University, and I want to welcome you to tonight's Discovery Lecture, the 10th in the series of these lectures, jointly sponsored by the Faculty of Science with help from the School of Journalism. The goal of these lectures has been to promote the importance of excellence in science journalism and communication, and tonight's talk is very representative of that goal and ambition. So, to lead into the talk, I'd like to introduce the person who helped bring forward tonight's speaker to Carleton, Professor Bob Burke from the Chair of the Department of Chemistry.
Good evening, everybody. Happy to see such a large crowd, not particularly surprised. The fact that the theater is so full really indicates that tonight's speaker doesn't really need an introduction because you're here because you know Jay Ingram already. However, I am going to tell you a few things about him. He's been in our homes via radio and television and print media for somewhat over 30 years now. You may have known him as a host of Quirks and Quarks, which he hosted for about 13 years, and more recently the Discovery Channel's Daily Planet for about 16 years. Still the best pair of science shows, in my opinion, on the media, on the airwaves these days. Jay's also a prolific writer and has several best-selling books to his credit. He also wrote a column for the science column for the Toronto Star for many years, and I could go on and on about other ways that he has brought science to us. But certainly Jay is not just a science news reader. We've come to trust his journalistic abilities, and so to expect articles and talks and shows that are informative and entertaining, but also educational and often somewhat provocative. So much of science journalism is in fact just fact reporting, which has its place in my opinion, but to have someone synthesize and explain the material and to have ideas that are new to most people, including scientists, presented in such a fashion is just a treat for everybody. In fact, Jay gave the Discovery Lecture 5 years ago, and it's not that we can't go out and find other speakers, it's that we didn't get enough of Jay 5 years ago, so we're having him back. The lecture 5 years ago was about consciousness in animals, and it's a great example of how Jay can inspire people to go away and think. I think most people went home and looked at their pets in a different way after that lecture. I know I did. Jay's accomplishments have, of course, been recognized with many awards, including 2 ACTRAs. I don't think I know another scientist that has an ACTRA award. Awards from the Royal Society, NSERC, and the Order of Canada for making science accessible. Honorary degrees from 5 Canadian universities, including Carleton, I'm proud to say, and several book awards. And he currently holds the chair in science communication at the Banff Centre. Tonight's presentation, as you can see, is entitled Truth and Inconvenience. Please join me in welcoming Jay Ingram.
I can go home now? So if you were at the Discovery Lecture that I gave and you went home and looked at your cat and thought about consciousness, I suspect you were disappointed. Dog, maybe not so much. No, I love cats too. So this is quite a different kind of lecture, and I want to start with an anecdote. Something that actually happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I'd just been grocery shopping, and I try and be responsible. I try to have a good diet, and I try to buy responsibly and eat responsibly. And among other things, I brought home some hummus. I like hummus. I think it's relatively healthy. Beans to make casseroles with. Some broth, because broth is good in lots of dishes. Some soup when I'm in a hurry, and some breakfast cereal like a muesli or something like that, and then a bunch of other stuff. And then I read an article by someone who's really a foodie, and it was called The 5 Foods You Should Never Eat. So one was hummus, and then there were, you should never buy beans. You can't buy canned beans, which I had done. BPA. You've got to just buy the raw beans and then soak them overnight. Why buy muesli? You can make it yourself. So I kept reading, and I started to get really angry. And I realized, and this is really going to be the theme of this talk tonight, I was angry because my values, as minimal as they might be, were being challenged by this person. And rather than look at what she was presenting from a factual or a data-oriented point of view, I was just reacting emotionally. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. When I gave this talk the title Truth and Inconvenience, I'm obviously borrowing from Al Gore, but when it comes to scientific controversy, I think the emerging evidence shows that, oddly enough, a controversy based in science does not cause people to form their opinions about the controversy on science. In other words, often and importantly, the data isn't really relevant to the decisions that people ultimately make. Now, I'll use examples from climate change because it's upon us. I live these days in Alberta, and as you all know, the oil sands are a huge issue, and responsible Albertans are trying to think their way through this issue and try and make some decisions, but there's the usual kind of knee-jerk responses on both sides of the spectrum. But it could be genetically modified foods, it could be the risks of nanotechnology, it could be nuclear power, it doesn't matter. All of these controversies where there are people absolutely against the technology or the science, people who are absolutely for it, have the same characteristic, and that is there are emotional, psychological, social, cultural influences that determine where people sit on the controversy. So, let's start on the football field. 1951. This is an Ivy League football game between Princeton and Dartmouth. It was the last game of the college football season in the Ivy League. It was a big game, not just because Princeton and Dartmouth are traditional rivals, but because this guy, Mike Kazmaier, it was his last game. He was going to win the Heisman Trophy, and college football fans in the audience know that's for being the best college player that year. So it was a big event. It turned out to be an incredibly rough game. Lots of penalties. Kazmaier had his nose broken, had to leave the game. They didn't actually wear face guards in those days. A Dartmouth player had his leg broken. There were injuries, there were penalties, it was a mess. The game was, instead of being the kind of celebratory college game, last game of the season, it was a debacle. There were two psychologists, one at Dartmouth and one at Princeton, who noted that the accounts of the game that you read in the Dartmouth student newspaper were very different from the accounts in the Princeton newspaper. And they realized they had a fabulous psychological experiment in their hands. Because in those days, there was only one game film. There weren't 12 cameras, replays, or anything like that. You had one document that recorded the event of this game. So they took the game film, showed it to a bunch of Princeton undergrads, showed it to a bunch of Dartmouth undergrads, and asked them for their opinions, and found, not surprisingly, that the Dartmouth students saw most of the penalties being committed by the Princeton players, and that most of the excessive penalties, the really egregious ones, also committed more by Princeton players than Dartmouth players, and the reverse when you went to the other school. And the psychologists concluded a really interesting thing which sets the tone for what I'm going to talk about tonight. They said, it isn't so much that they saw the same game in different ways. It's as if they saw two different games. They were two completely different experiences, depending on what? Depending on where your allegiance was before the game. And this is going to come up more than once tonight, the idea of that what you're thinking or what you're believing before the event colors very strongly how you perceive the event. So, this is a fictitious guy named Robert Linden, and he plays a key role in an experiment I'm about to describe to you. But before I do, I'm going to set the table with the kind of analysis that is going to follow through for the whole evening. There's a group called the Cultural Cognition Network in the eastern United States. And they argue that when it comes to scientific controversies, and I've said this, but I'll say it again because it's important, where people sit on, yes, I'm a believer, no, I'm not a believer, depends on a couple of social cultural measures, and here they are. One is, where do you sit on a dimension that at one end is individualist, like here I'm a rugged individualist, I don't need the government to take care of me, whereas on the other end from that, you're communitarian. So you feel very strongly you're part of a community and you feel that governments should care for all the members of the community. So individualist versus communitarian. And the other dimension is hierarchical. Do you think that a stratified society with some people clearly having more privileges than others is justifiable? Or are you egalitarian? Hierarchical to egalitarian, where you believe that really we all deserve the same chance at success. This group of researchers says where you find yourself on those two dimensions, and it's easy to tell, you can just do a pencil and paper test in a lab, will determine to a large extent where you position yourself on a scientific controversy. Okay, so here's one experiment that shows this. People were shown, students were shown this picture, Robert Linden. And they were told about Robert Linden, two different groups of students. So one was told he got his PhD from MIT. He is a prof at Harvard. He's a climatologist. He's a member of the National Academy of Science. The other group were told essentially the same thing with a couple of changes. And then they were told, we're going to give you this. Robert Linden has just written a book about climate change. We're going to let you look at the opening few paragraphs of the introduction. And then we want you to tell us, would you recommend this book to your friends? Okay? So, important point here is that Robert Linden, in either version, has exactly the same qualifications. So, I'll just show you part. In one of the intros, it started like this. It's now beyond reasonable scientific dispute that human activity is causing global warming. The other one started like this. Judging by conventional scientific standards, it's premature to conclude that human activity is causing global warming. So you had two completely diametrically opposed accounts written, apparently, by two people who have exactly the same qualifications. So how would these people, when asked to recommend or not recommend this book, how would they choose? There's really no data to choose from. And sure enough, about 80% of the people who you would say were egalitarian and communitarian, and I'll explain why these fall out the way they do in just a sec, thought that this would be a recommended book. They believe we're changing the climate, and therefore the only book that they'd recommend to their friends was one that supported their own belief. For those people who are hierarchical and individualist, this book sounded pretty good, but the other one clearly was not worth recommending. Now, why would these social, cultural attributes make people make decisions about what is a scientific issue? Well, roughly speaking, individualists don't want a lot of government in their life. And climate change, if there's action to be taken about climate change, it would obviously involve governments, carbon taxes, restrictions on, you know what it is. I mean, I could give other examples, but basically, I mean, even as far as the UN recommending certain steps. So there would be layers of government taking actions. Individualists don't like that. What about egalitarian and communitarians? In general, they're a little bit suspicious of industry because they feel that industry promotes unfair distribution of wealth. So they really think that doing something about climate change makes sense because, after all, it's big oil companies making a lot of money. We got to save the earth. And so they would tend to believe or tend to want to recommend the book that urges action against climate change. So this is just one example of many studies that show when people are presented with a controversy, they will choose the side of the controversy that actually supports already held positions, already held social, cultural beliefs. So it really isn't about the data. And this brings up a really interesting point. Scientists are, or not all scientists clearly, but many scientists have argued for a long time that the real problem in resolving scientific controversies is that citizens, average citizens, just don't know enough about science. They're not scientifically literate. I started following these studies in the mid-'80s, and they went through the '90s and into the early 2000s. And in general, these are like telephone surveys, and they ask people, what's DNA? Or do you know what DNA is? And if they say yes, then they get a little tick. Those surveys tended to show, on average, that about 10% of a typical adult audience can read a scientific article in the New York Times or the Globe and understand it. So 90% of the general public, according to those studies, don't understand science. So, and it was a strongly held position in the scientific community that there's no wonder there's controversy about, let's say, climate change or genetically modified organisms. It's just that people don't know enough science. And if they only knew more science, then we would be able to resolve all these controversies, obviously in science's favor. But these studies that show that people make decisions not based on data, but based on the values that they already have, shows that the importance of literacy is really been grossly exaggerated, and that if people are now going to deal with scientific controversies in an effective way, they have to take that into account. So this is Boston goalie Tim Thomas, who achieved some degree of fame or infamy a couple of months ago when he refused to go to the White House. Well, and then, he expanded on these views a little bit by saying that he was a libertarian, didn't really believe in big government. And he also added in a little noticed quote, "I don't believe in global warming." Well, he's a good goalie. But I'm pretty sure that he doesn't, I don't want to insult him, but I'm pretty sure he hasn't read a lot about climate change. But the point is, that view, I don't believe in climate change, falls naturally out of the fact that he's a libertarian. He's an individualist, he's hierarchical, and so he lies on that side of the spectrum. And so he's a skeptic about global warming. Let me make an important point here, and that is, by the same token, there are people on the other side who absolutely believe we're going to hell in a handbasket because of climate change. And it's not because they know the data better than Tim Thomas. People at the two extremes of this discussion will still make up their minds based on their values. And in fact, all of us in this room are influenced by that first and foremost. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we get there. But I'm using climate change examples, but it could be anything, and it could in fact deal with either side of any one of these controversies. Sorry, I just want to throw in one more quote. Rick Santorum has dropped out of the Republican race for the nomination for the presidential election, but here's what he said about climate change, global warming, just an excuse for more government control of your life. I mean, if that doesn't underline what I was saying about the libertarian, individualist, hierarchical attitude toward a scientific issue like climate change, that should seal it. Anyway, he's not in the running anymore. So, if scientific literacy were important, it should show up, right? If it can play some important role beyond these values that I've been talking about, these non-scientific values, you should see an influence. So here's an interesting study. People were asked, how much risk do you believe climate change poses to human health, security, or prosperity? And here's where the results. when people were not scientifically literate, now, obviously there's a gigantic spread in who believes that climate change is a threat. But the spread was like that. But when you come to scientifically literate people who don't believe in climate change or don't believe we're causing climate change, they're even less. They believe it in even less when they know a lot of science. Now, does that make sense? You could excuse people for not knowing any science at all to just adhere to their values. But when they know some science and they become even more disbelieving, it's really interesting. So what is that saying? Well, it might say that disbelievers, if you want to call them that, hierarchical individualists, when they know some science, really do see real holes in the science, and that supports what they already think. Or, because that's one possibility, it may be that they persuade themselves that they see holes in the science and therefore become more disbelieving. I'll show you another interesting example of the same kind of question. How much risk do you believe nuclear power poses to human health, safety, or prosperity? And here, when you look at the difference between literate and non-literate, you get a really curious thing. So they're not that far apart when they don't know anything about the science. When they do know something about the science, the hierarchical individualists are really trusting of nuclear power. But even the others, the communitarians, the Birkenstock-wearing, latte-sipping crowd, it's hard being an Albertan when I have to admit I'm from Toronto. Even egalitarian communitarians start to think that there's not as much risk to nuclear power once they know some science. But there's another curious thing about this graph. They're pretty close together when they don't know any science. When they know some science, they're actually further apart. So the lesson in these studies is that these social cultural measures that apply to all of us actually determine to a large extent where people stand in these controversies. That's something that is not widely recognized. Now, this raises some obvious and I think interesting questions. If you want the general population to come to some sort of consensus about an issue, it could be nuclear power, it could be climate change. How are you going to do that when people are not making up their minds based on the information about the technologies or the science that you can provide them? I should say parenthetically here that there's a lot of really interesting psychology that goes on here. So let's say I'm an individualist and I don't really like the idea that of big government, and then I'm presented with some of the science arguing that climate change is being influenced by us, and the only way we can slow it down is to establish a carbon tax, which immediately says to me, more bureaucrats, more government, more interference in my life. But I would not say that to myself. There's something here operating called confirmation bias, which is like this. I can show you two scientific papers, one of which says climate change is happening, one of which says no evidence that it's happening, and by all measures, they're equivalent. The sample sizes are big enough to whatever the data is well constructed, the data is well grounded, the references are equivalent, the people doing the study are good scientists. Everything is equal except that the two studies, which you'd have to invent for this purpose, come to opposite conclusions. Now, what has been clearly shown with any number of issues, people will look at these and they will find flaws in the paper that clashes with their beliefs. They're not doing it consciously, they're not doing it deliberately. But if you give them enough time, this is done spectacularly well in the late 70s with students who believed that capital punishment either deterred or didn't deter the murder rate. The longer they have to study, the more they'll find what they think are flaws in these papers, even though, really, they're equivalent. So it's a subtle, unknowable mental action that you're taking, a psychological trick called confirmation bias that predisposes you to accept the paper that agrees with the views you already hold. Same thing holds for sources of information. I showed you the Robert Linden thing and how people, depending on what kind of people they are, what sort of values they hold, either trust him as a source or not. So think about people that you have discussions with, and they can name 5 sources of data showing that what their view is correct. How do they identify those sources as being reputable and believable? Well, they're people that say what they want to hear. And so if you have a range of opinion, and I don't want to accept this particular angle of this controversy, I'll find people who disagree with it, and they will seem to me to be believable sources. So I'll collect a group of sources, but I'm not doing it because they've offered the best arguments with the best data. I'm doing it because they agree with the feelings, with the thoughts that I already had. If you go back to the first example that I gave, where I was hurt that my grocery shopping values were being challenged. A nice way to think of this is to think of all of us belonging to tribes, groups of people with shared values. So, you know, you live in a neighborhood, you probably share values with most or some of the people in that neighborhood, but not with all. There are many, many factors that determine that: income, neighborhood, do you have kids, do you know other families with kids? But you share values largely based on these hierarchical, individualist kind of dimensions. Nobody who belongs to a group likes to have the values of their group challenged. So, I don't want to hear that my driving a Hummer is damaging to the planet. It just makes me uncomfortable. How do I resolve that discomfort? I find sources that argue against the reliability of the climate change data, and I resort to those when I make my decisions about where I stand in that controversy. As a person who's spent, as Dr. Burke said, 30 some odd years communicating science, this is a somewhat upsetting thing to know. Because, you know, I like data, and I like the stories about the Earth that you can weave using data. And it's, you know, disconcerting to find out that when it comes to the important kinds of science communication, which are, how do you resolve this controversy? Well, let's inform people that really you are fighting a totally uphill battle. So, what can be done about it? There have been a couple of suggestions. I'm not actually convinced by either suggestion as to how to get around this issue, but I'll tell you what they are anyway. I should add, this is all quite new research. Like, it's all been developed in the last 2 or 3 years. So some of it may turn out not to be true, but it certainly has the ring of truth for me. So one of the things is the importance of the source of the information, as I said before. So here we have, same guy, has a different name in this experiment, but he looks pretty classically conservative. Nice knot in his tie, good haircut. And then there's the other guy who's a little bit more, you know, not conservative. And so let me give you a different controversy. Human papillomavirus, it's very controversial as to whether 11 and 12-year-old girls should be vaccinated against this virus, even though the science says it would pretty much guarantee defense against cervical cancer. But conservative groups have argued that it just will encourage promiscuity. So, you're not likely to sway anybody. So, you know, all of you in this audience would come down somewhere in that controversy. And some of you would be at really far on one end, and some would be really far at the other. And if we send out Mr. Conservative to try and persuade you that it's a bad idea, that would be quite consistent, right? He looks conservative, he's making a conservative argument. You probably wouldn't sway anybody. But what if you sent out the guy with the beard to say, I think this is a really bad idea? That's a bit jarring. You're not expecting this guy to give the conservative argument. And it doesn't have to be HPV, it could be climate change. I mean, imagine if you go to a public event and this guy is saying there's no way that there's any truth to climate change. It would be, I wouldn't go so far as to say to be unsettling, but it would be unexpected. And such experiments as have been done, and there haven't been many, suggest that you do destabilize people a little bit if the source of the information is different from what you expect. So some people have suggested this might be a way, because what we really want in the end, right, is the most open-minded discussion of these kinds of serious issues. Well, maybe that's one way, is that you play around with who's giving the information, and that might change people's mind. As I say, I'm not really sold that in the long run that would work. Another suggestion has been this, that if you look at those two groups of people that I've been discussing, the egalitarian communitarians, who are maybe a little bit distrustful of big corporations and industry, and the other group who buy into that, they love the inventiveness and success of industry. Well, what if you salted one argument with a little bit of the other? Let me show you what I mean. I know some people at the University of Calgary who believe that climate change is serious and something should be done about it, but their solution is not to increase taxes or to encourage everyone to drive a Prius, but to create a technology to take carbon dioxide directly out of the ambient air. Not trapping it at smokestacks, but actually taking it out of the air. Huge advantage to this technology is you can put it anywhere in the world. Like, you don't have to build it on top of a coal plant. You could put it in the Sahara. It doesn't matter, because carbon dioxide is everywhere. And the reason this might be an interesting approach is that cars, trucks, planes, there is no known sensible engineering way of trapping the carbon dioxide emitted by small mobile emitters like that. So, just to give you a sense of what these people are thinking about, here's an animation. Big fans drawing air through, air is being absorbed in this particular system, is being exposed to sodium hydroxide, carbon dioxide is being changed to a carbonate salt, and you're taking carbon dioxide out of the air on a grand scale like that. And when I say grand scale, there's what they envision as one such unit. And to give you a little bit of a size estimate, there are two people right here. So, you know, if you built, the calculations have been done. The cost is an issue at the moment, but if you built many of these, thousands, you could actually extract gigantic amounts of carbon dioxide out of the air. So, to get over the issue that I'm talking about, like how do you get people thinking at least on the same page? One of the suggestions is, well, if your hierarchical individualists tend not to believe in climate change, but love big technology, maybe you sort of combine the two and you say, look at this, here's a fantastic idea. It may be fantastic in the fantasy sense, but a fantastic idea. It's really ingenious. There's a startup company. They're going to make millions. And oh, what do? They take carbon dioxide out of the air because they think that's a serious problem. You could think of lots of examples where what appeals to one side can be mixed with something that appeals to the other in the hopes of bringing the entire group together. As I say, I'm not actually convinced by this either. But you know, if this were not government funded, but private money, then you know, I think people who aren't comfortable with the idea of climate change might be quite disposed to this. Yeah, I don't think those are great solutions to this issue. And yet, so it's a little bit frustrating because I can't stand here in front of you and say, here's the issue. Big scientific controversies are dividing people based not on the scientific basis at all, but on other characteristics. And yet I can't at the same time say, here's how we solve that. But it's new. These are things that we do have to think about when communicating science. But there are a couple of other features of these experiments that really interest me that may not have any practical spin-off. But for instance, you think of these two dimensions, hierarchical, egalitarian, communitarian, individual. How do you end up somewhere in that? Like, what dictates how you become one or the other or a mixture of those people? Is it your parents? Teacher, mentor, person in the church? Television? I don't think it's television. How does that happen? I think that's and the people that do these experiments, the cultural cognition people, do not have the answer to that question. I don't think they're that interested in it even. They don't know how we end up there. And another and probably more important question is, how fluidly can we move along those dimensions so that persuasive arguments, can they actually move you from one side to the other? What influences that? Surely not everybody just becomes, bang, bang, they're sitting here and they'll be that way for the rest of their lives. Some people start out liberal and become conservative, and maybe fewer start out conservative and become liberal, I don't know. But there are changes. So that's another, so I think where you land, why you land there, how you can move, those are all really crucial questions. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this, which is also a bit, probably the diciest when it comes to the actual science, but of course, as is often the case, that's the best, most fun part, is to consider the question as to whether biology plays a role. In other words, is there something in our brains that eventually leads to these attitudes? And I'm going to have to do a quick translation here. And instead of talking about hierarchical, blah, 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 let's talk about political parties, because they do group pretty nicely with those characteristics. And with apologies to all of Canada, all of this research has been done in the US. Mostly because you've got two well-defined political parties, Republicans, Democrats, that line up pretty nicely with these social cultural values. So let me rephrase that question. Is there something about a Democrat's brain that is different from a Republican's brain? And there have been, 8 or 10 studies that have been done on this, in this topic, and I'm going to just mention 3 or 4 of them, the ones that I find the most intriguing. They may not be in the long run the most convincing. It may not be that this is a hugely important area, but it's growing fast. People are more and more interested in the idea that somehow, when it comes to an election, people are not even listening to the campaign. They're voting according to the structure of their brain. So, for instance, I'm just going to mention one particular part of the brain, and that's this red area here called the anterior cingulate cortex, the red streak. It's particularly active when you're doing something called conflict monitoring. And that is, you're doing something, the best example is you're doing something habitual. Let's say you've got a computer screen, every time you see a plus sign, you hit go. Every time you see a minus sign, you hit stop. But about 90% of them are pluses. So you're sitting there and going like this, plus, plus, hit, hit, hit. Oh, there's a minus sign. And in that little moment, when you suddenly have to stop and reassess and change what you're doing, the anterior cingulate gets really active because its job is to sort of look for conflict. Here's another example that I'm sure most of you have seen at one point in your life. This is an abstracted version of something called the Stroop test. But if I ask you just to read those words, that's not very difficult. Red, blue, green. And in fact, it's not difficult if I ask you to name the colors in the same order, right? Red, well, orange, red, blue, green. So naming the colors, not the words. Now do it as fast as you can now. Your anterior cingulates are going crazy because you're so used to reading words that when I ask you, and it's okay when the word color is congruent with the actual word, but when the word is saying one thing and its color is different, it's very difficult to manage. And you stumble and you pause. So that's an example of conflict monitoring. If we only had enough MRIs to go around the crowd, we would show that your anterior cingulate got really busy. So here's an experiment. Republicans and Democrats were doing one of those no-go tasks that I referred to before, hitting a button, and then when it changes, you got to change. The Democrats' anterior cingulate got way more active when there was a need to pause, reassess, and then change than did the Republicans. Republicans, it sounds like an insult, but it's not intended to be, just kind of steamed right through and didn't notice with quite the same acuity that something had changed. So, you know, the tendency of people that do these experiments is to imbue them with much more importance than I think they deserve. I mean, you know, that doesn't automatically say that Republicans are traditionalists and Democrats are more willing to change. I mean, all it says is their anterior cingulate reacts, on average, differently. There was another study, though, that showed that, in fact, in terms of actual volume, the anterior cingulate of Democrats is bigger than the same brain structure in Republicans. And it's not just that particular part of the brain. There's also a very well-known little structure down here called the amygdala, which is involved in a lot of emotional perception and action and reaction to emotion, but is particularly concerned with fear, recognizing fearful faces. The amygdala is very important in that. Democrats and Republicans have different sized amygdala too. And there was one study that showed that when people were faced with threatening situations, either sudden loud noise, like that, or off-putting pictures like a man with a giant spider on his face or a person with blood on their face, things like that, Republicans reacted much more strongly to those fearful situations than did Democrats. And in this paper was hilarious because they actually characterized people not just by their party affiliation, but by things that they felt were important for the US. So those people that felt that defense spending, the war in Iraq, patriotism, and something else, who were mostly Republicans, had reacted strongly to these fearful stimuli, but people who believed in liberalizing the immigration laws, more foreign aid, pacifism, and so on, reacted less. Okay, so what does that mean? So I think you could say this. There are physiological differences in brains, on average, between people with strongly held political beliefs on one side or the other. Can you link that to what I've been talking about, that the positions people take that aren't necessarily belonging to a political party, but sort of social cultural positions? I don't know. I think the jury's out on that. I should just say, anecdotally, that the most amazing study of all these Republican versus Democrat studies, and I'm really actually not happy that none of this work, as far as I know, has been done in Canada. I don't know why. I mean, surely you could do it. They asked college students, they showed college students standardized pictures of all the people who'd run for the Senate in states other than the one in which they lived. Well, you know, college students have no clue who's running. If you're in Arizona, you have no clue who's running for the Senate in New Hampshire. So they showed them all these faces, and they were all standardized, same grayscale, same size, cropped the same way, and then said, okay, tell us which ones are Democrats and which ones are Republicans. So 60% accuracy on that, over thousands. So that's actually pretty good. And then they thought, well, you know, these are professional politicians, so they've probably learned to look the right way, get the right haircut, you know, project a certain kind of smile, sort of like TV. And that's what's allowing people to judge. So let's do this study again, only better. We'll go to college yearbooks and select students who were in the Students for the Republican Party or the Young Democrats and see if other students can pick those people out. Now, come on, they're 20, 21 years old. 60% accuracy. Okay, so are there actually differences between Republicans and Democrats' faces? You know, it sounds unbelievable, right? But in fact, you would be shocked to know what faces can reveal about people. And I'll just give you one crazy example. And most of this work comes out of Scotland. They have fantastic groups there working on face perception. Women can do quite well in judging whether the man's face that they're looking at, whether that man is unfaithful to his girlfriend or spouse or not, or has a tendency to do that or not, or is violent or not. It's all based on testosterone. The more testosterone from birth, the heavier boned the face is, the more testosterone, the more likely a man is to be unfaithful, the more likely he is to be violent. And so it's not quite as magical and unbelievable as it sounds. So whether this is true of politics or not, I don't know. But so that's where we sit. So I just want to kind of summarize this, because I do think that this is really, going forward, is really important that all of us understand that when it comes to controversies that seem to you to have solid data either on one side or the other, you do have to take a step back and think, what am I projecting onto this data that's making me draw this conclusion? Because, you know, there might be the odd individual who sits right in the middle and actually does just act on the data, but I find that highly unlikely. The rest of us are normal. We belong to a tribe. We don't like our values being challenged. And we will subconsciously, or unconsciously, to be more correct, read into the data that's being presented to us either flaws or advantages that concur with what we already feel. So the next time that you pick up a newspaper, and this happens to everybody, and see an article that runs against what you believe, don't just, throw it aside and say that's nonsense. Read it and try and see where why that person draws the conclusions they do, and be careful, be careful to try and monitor your own reaction to it before dismissing them as being hopelessly biased. This is I think the next decade or so in these kinds of studies is going to reveal a lot about why we choose positions that we do and why we take stances in scientific controversy. And these are important. Like the decisions taken on issues like genetically modified food, when we're going to have to feed 9 to 10 billion people in 2050, and we're already pressuring the world's water, dumping herbicides and pesticides, and doing all the things that enabled the Green Revolution. Really, nobody thinks we can continue to do that for another 2 to 3 billion people. Well, then, you have to, so the argument about genetically modified food is an important one. The argument about climate change is an important one. Risks of nanotechnology. They're all supremely important, and right now, at least in the general public, they're being carried by values that people aren't even really totally aware that they have. So that's my message tonight. You belong to a tribe, don't deny it, but try and analyze your own views through that lens, because it's really important for all of us to make sensible views as much as we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Jay has kindly consented to taking some questions tonight. I'm going to ask people who have questions to follow two rules. One, come up and use the microphone and speak clearly so everybody can hear your question. And two, because we expect quite a few questions, to perhaps limit yourself to one question apiece. So, at the microphone if you would. Could you come forward to the mic, please?
So, first of all, with 30 years in industry, in science, I quite agree that people make their decisions, from what I've seen, exactly on the tribe that they're in, not based on a scientific analysis. It's pretty apparent. But there is one thing I'd like to point out, and the concept that scientific expertise or any sort of expertise, like you have a degree, you know, I got 3 of them, big deal. So you have a degree that this is going to make you better able to make a decision on something like climate change is quite frankly wrong. And I'll give you an example. I was sitting across from a production manager at work and referring to 2 R&D PhDs, you know, in the same company. He said, ignorance never stopped those 2 from having an opinion. And, you know, I'm in the R&D organization. You think, well, we should have put that guy down. What a thing to say. But the truth is, he's quite right. Most of people in science work in a relatively small silo. I mean, they have to be an expert at something. You take 2 steps out of that silo or 3 steps out of that silo into a different area, like what kind of beans are good for you, or what climate change, for example, what's the best thing to do. And yes, you have some general understanding, but your ability to make a correct analysis of what to do is probably no better than the guy driving the bus. So that's really what I have to say. I don't think you should think that you're going to get a more intelligent response to the problem because you picked a lawyer or a scientist whose expertise is switch cap filters or optical transmission, and you say, well, what do you think you should do about climate change?
No, yeah, no, I agree. But so I would, I mean, there are a couple of things you said that I like. One is that whenever I talk about this, people's reaction is like yours. Yeah, sure, I know that happens. Everybody seems to know this happens, and yet it's only in the last 2 or 3 years there have actually been experiments that demonstrate, yes, this is how people make decisions. So I just say that. And of course, I agree with you that, let's say, an evolutionary biologist, with all due respect to those in the crowd, is probably no more expert in judging climate change data at first glance. But the point here is communication. And you take an issue like climate change, ultimately the data is the most important thing. I mean, you know what I mean? If the physics doesn't make sense, then who cares about rising carbon dioxide? And there are people who do understand that data and do understand the significance of it. The key is, how does that get communicated or translated from those whose expertise you and I would agree on to the rest of the people who collectively have to make the decision? And the barrier to doing that effectively is what I was talking about. So I'm not saying that anybody is particularly, other than the people who are totally familiar with the data. So in the case of climate change, one would think climatologists. The issue is communicating it to policymakers, to government, to people in the street, to all of us. And we have to recognize that there is this inbuilt difficulty in getting people to consider the data. And so, you know, there's a perhaps uncomfortably important role given to science communicators. Because in some senses, we're all biased too, right? So as a communicator, I can just choose to pick these data that I think are most relevant to my life, and that would be a mistake. So, you know, I'm not even saying this is a soluble problem, but I'm saying it is a problem that we all have to face. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm lucky enough to TA a course that is called Research and Policy Methods. So half of the course is dealing with...
Some people wouldn't think that was so lucky, but...
the note of sardonic tone in my voice.
Yes, dark sarcasm.
The first half is trying to teach students who are aiming for policy careers a little bit of scientific research methodology background so that they at least have an idea what goes on in there. And then the second half is trying to take a look at how policy is actually formulated, which has very little to do with the first half of the course, unfortunately. And so I sympathize very much with what you're saying about the tribes and confirmation bias, which in the, for example, in the international relations literature has been around since the 60s. This isn't breaking new research in some areas. My question for you, though, is concerning the two dimensions you're talking about, the individualist versus communitarian, and the hierarchical versus egalitarian. This sounds a lot to me like, I don't remember the terms in political science, but again, two different dimensions working at cross angles. In your talk, you were referring typically to individualist hierarchical people and communitarian egalitarian people. Have you seen anything that is talking about individualist egalitarian and hierarchical communitarian? I bring this up especially in the Canadian context, knowing that the research is in the US, because in the US that dimension has been collapsed down to Republican Democrat.
Yeah.
And in Canada we actually see a bit of diversity within the political parties, so that it's not just two extremes along one dimension, but you do have to use the dimensions.
Right. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that while I did leap over to Republicans and Democrats, I hope I made clear that that was a kind of condensation of the research. And the way the research has been conducted is really based on establishing these dimensions on work that was, I think, done probably in the late 60s or early 70s. But whether you can actually, whether there's enough people that are, say, hierarchical and communitarian, or even, I don't think you can have that. I mean, the hierarchical and egalitarian are at opposite ends. So you're saying, could you take one from one dimension and one from a different one and collapse them together?
Are these two dimensions rather than just one?
Well, I can only say that isn't what the studies so far have dealt with. I would suspect that those tend to group together, hierarchical and individualism, for instance, because a communitarian and an individualists don't care about the community so much. Could an individualist be an egalitarian? I don't know, we need to go to the pub and talk about this. But okay, so can I give you a half-decent answer? Well, probably not, except that this is where the research has taken it so far, and as I tried to make clear, this has got to be refined and disentangled over the next few years. And, as I said, maybe one of the reasons this research has not done in Canada is because there are greater nuances in the political spectrum. But still, remember, I live in Alberta. Danielle Smith just said 2 days ago, the science isn't settled in climate change. Now, Danielle Smith is pretty smart. Maybe she reads Journal of Climate, or maybe she has advisors who are climatologists, but it isn't surprising that as a self-confessed libertarian, she doesn't believe the science of climate change is settled. Besides, if she's premier, she's got oil sands to defend. Political expedience also plays a role in all of this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes?
I'm still kind of confused about why it's pretty difficult to say the colors when the word is different.
Did you have difficulty doing it? Yeah. Well, that's good. You're a normal human being. So that's step one. That's important. The reason it's difficult is that you're seeing a word. And what do you do when you see words? You read them, right? So you see the word red, R-E-D. But I'm asking you not to say the word to yourself. I'm asking you to name the color that those letters are printed in which case I think it was blue. So you're supposed to say blue, but your normal reaction is to read the word. So I show you a word, bang. What do? You say red. No, that isn't what I asked you. I asked you, what color is this word? And it turns out to be blue. And so your brain is used to doing one thing, but and it's automatic, right? It's like riding a bicycle, but you have to stop your brain from doing what it usually does and get it to do the thing that I asked you to do?
Yeah, my dad forgot to tell me about the new
Well,
brakes
it's your
on my
dad's
new
fault
bike.
then, right? I don't actually think it's your dad's fault. I think I might not have explained it as well the first time around. Sorry, we're going to, you wait, I'm coming over here. Yeah.
With your, actually the previous
You can just do
question
this and I'll know what you're talking
okay.
about.
The question with your dimensions of, if you could repeat them for me, it was...
Do I have to? Okay, so you're either hierarchical because you believe in a stratified society, or you're egalitarian, you'd like it all to be flat. That's one. You're an individualist, you'd rather not have government in your life. You're a communitarian, you want one for all for one.
Okay. There's some more complex versions of that map on.
I have no doubt.
Jonathan Haidt springs to mind with his 5 pillars. Now he's talking more about moral foundations, but it maps very well politically. My question is like you were talking about a lot of this research being American-centric. Now, how much of this two tribes phenomenon do you think is actually an artifact of their political system? If you went to Europe,
I don't think so at all.
No?
No, it's not just two tribes, and I'm sorry if I left that impression. We all belong to some sort of tribe. You know, the guys that I regularly go to breakfast with in Toronto every 5 weeks or so, like we all have shared values, more or less politically the same. We all enjoy the outdoors. We like riding bikes, you know, whatever. And I think it's fair to say that we all can identify a kind of subgroup of the city, in this case, or wherever you live, with whom you're most comfortable and with whom you share the most values. So that's what I mean by a tribe, not a definition. I mean, that's not a definition that would use in the literature. That's just a handy way of trying to get people to understand that very few of us stand alone. And as soon as we share values with others, we don't want to be rejected by them, nor do we want those values challenged, or we're not comfortable with them being challenged by people from the outside. That's the only sense in which I'm using tribe.
But you're relating it to the brain. So are you saying that it's is it a group value, or is it that we're concerned with, or is it just that these people group together and they all feel the same way, that's why they're rejecting the science? So is it the group?
I think it's kind of isn't that the same thing? A group value, or people that group together because their values are the same, or people that group together because their brains tend to create the same sorts of values. I mean, I think there's something in there that is a commonality. But look, I mean, these are good questions because this is not if I can quote Danielle Smith, the science isn't settled. and so, you know, I hope you didn't come here hoping for a lecture that would be, you know, okay, beginning, middle, end, go home, you got a conclusion. I mean, even last time you had to go home and look at your cat. So this time you have to go home and say, what the hell was he talking about anyway? Okay. Yes. Oh, sorry about the profanity. Forgot myself. Yes.
I read in a fact book that kids can see stuff that adults can't. Can they identify politics and governments as well?
Well, you know, I don't think that people have done a lot of experiments about that, but I would be quite happy if we let kids make decisions about big controversies. I think they probably could do just as well as the adults. Do you agree? Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
So I think these account really well for situations where there is a little bit of scientific controversy, but how does it account for situations in which the alternate arguments are almost entirely, say, religiously oriented?
There's no, to my knowledge, there's been no research done on that, but I mean, you know, so the temptation would be to say, well, okay, if religious beliefs are playing a large role in this, does that square with these kind of social cultural values that I'm talking about? But you know, as tempting as that would be, and in fact, the danger in all of this is it does seem to fit so well with things that the temptation is to use it to explain everything, and I think that would be a mistake. I think that so far the only distance you could take this is as far as the experiments. No experiments, at least in this vein, have been done about religion. But your question, see, this is one of my great skills, is that I can take a question to which I really have no answer and turn it into a mini lecture. Anyway, I do want to say something on that. Not all scientific controversies have this attribute. So, you know,
evolution, for example.
Well, evolution is like a special case, but it's more than just, my guess would be it's more than just religion. You know, there was an interesting paper, a sociological paper published just last month showing that since 1974, and this is not political parties, but liberals, small L liberals, small c conservatives. Liberals have maintained their faith in science, pretty steady straight line. Conservatives have lost faith in science steadily since the mid-70s. So that starts to, you know, if people who take a literal view of the Bible, for instance, tend to be conservative, which I would think that might be true, then you've got some sort of correlation there. But the point that I started to make was there are lots of scientific controversies where, you know, let's take one in astronomy, you know, where there are discussions about what is dark energy, what is dark matter. There's a little bit of tribalism that goes on there among the scientists, but it doesn't reach the public. And there are lots of issues in science that reach the public where the public has no difficulty coming to consensus. But in these particularly high value, high voltage controversies, this is where you see the preeminent role of values. So I'm not saying every single scientific controversy is dependent on this, but what I see as the most important ones are. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, another challenging question. Yes?
Are you the guy from Daily Planet?
That isn't even a simple question. I was. But I did that for like three times as long as you've been alive. And so that was, you can imagine how tired you get sometimes. You can imagine how I felt. And so I just wanted to go out and see, if you host Daily Planet, which I did do, you are in the television studio every single day, Monday to Friday. You never get a break. And I finally decided there were other things that I'd like to do. So yes, I did. And that is me. Yeah.
Yeah, regarding the determination of the level of scientific literacy,
yeah.
You mentioned this, you know, where conclusions of about 10% based on some, you know, some criteria. And the example that you gave of the question was, to me, it was a question that is asking about somebody's knowledge about the results of scientific research in a particular field. How much attempt is made to distinguish that, knowing the results of science, okay, which you could, you know, which a person can absorb simply by wide reading in the popular press, as opposed to understanding the scientific process?
No attention paid to understanding the scientific process at all. Scientific literacy studies have almost never done that. That's one of the reasons I think they're dumb. I mean, you know, there was a book published in the 90s that purported to make you scientifically literate if you read the book, which clearly is what you're talking about. Like, it's just a bunch of facts. And because they're phone interviews, it would be quite a mental gymnastic exercise to figure out questions that would probe over the phone whether somebody understood the scientific process. So no, these are based on, does the Earth go around the sun or the sun go around the Earth? Can you sterilize milk? No, can you remove radioactivity from milk by boiling it? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that are on scientific literacy surveys. And still only 10% know the answers. And it's even more brutal if they do follow-up questions. So they say, do you know what DNA is? Somebody says, yeah, I know. What is it? And if they say, it's something in the blood, that's counted correct. So, you know, but frankly, and I think you get the tone from some of the questions and what I said, I once wrote an article for a science magazine called Scientific Literacy, or Bamboo Under My Fingernails. I just don't like the topic very much. And I don't really think it's actually useful to know.
Yeah, I mean, so given that, is there not need for studies that base the identification of the populations on
some deeper knowledge?
Yeah.
But they don't have it. So, like, if 10% of the audience can read, not this audience, of course, at least 15 or 16%. If 10% of the general public can understand an article in the newspaper that is results-oriented, how many people are going to understand the scientific process? You're not going to have enough sample to run an experiment. No, I'm serious. The point of that, though, was how interesting it is. Okay, you say, okay, people are making up their minds on what I considered, if I were a scientist, maybe I'd say, kind of bogus reasons, like where they see themselves in society and so on. And yet, if those same people are scientifically literate, their already held views are even more strongly held. So scientific literacy isn't allowing people to consider, so-called, or, you know, and I would suspect that even if people understood the scientific process, I would find it hard to believe that they would abandon these very cherished, tightly held social cultural positions. It'd be interesting, but I don't know who your sample would be. The 6 people in Ottawa that know. Sorry.
So I'm very interested in the concept of how people would move across these spectrums,
yeah,
and how the source of what they're seeing would influence potentially how they move, which I think there's probably a correlation there. Wondering what your thoughts are on the different media outlets and how they might have a bias, and if people tend to watch or read one type of paper and not see the other perspective. Or another, I think maybe a more dangerous thing that's coming up, something like Google, where if I search for, say, health, and I've done a series of searches on fitness previously, it's going to selectively prioritize articles of a certain slant or viewpoint based on my prior history, right?
Yeah.
So that's serving to just polarize my viewpoint by giving me more and more things that are reinforcing my confirmation bias.
That's an excellent point.
How are you going to, or how should we be structuring things like search engines, things like social media to try and eliminate that effect? Because the companies are doing the exact opposite. They're targeting all the ads, they're targeting all the content towards you based on your history, based on what they think you like. So how do you get the other perspective in there? And what impact is that going to have on what you're speaking about?
Well, that's a fantastic question, which I can't answer, but of course I'll go on. So if we go to the old school media, like newspapers, I've always forced myself to read newspapers whose general editorial slant might not be consistent with mine. And I really think that's important. Now, so I obviously can't address the Google part of this, but the thing that I have discovered in doing that is that there actually is more diversity in views than my initial thought was. But it also is useful because it helps you hone your arguments, because you start to see, okay, here are a whole bunch of points of view that I don't agree with, but they're not uniform. How do they arrive at these? What are their techniques? How do they argue? How do they look at a scientific paper and then write something that, to me, seems to run completely against the tenor of the scientific paper? So it's a useful exercise that way in understanding media. But the Google question is really important, and I wonder, yeah, I'd have to think about that, because it would be kind of cool to have a website that you could go to that would challenge you, you know, or a search engine that would just say, you already know that. Try this. It'll be called Try This, and you heard it from me first.
I have another media-related question. It's very common on the media to try and create controversy.
Yep.
And I'm wondering to what extent you think that tendency plays a role in in setting up these dichotomies in some cases. For example, if I'll make up some numbers, but if there are 99 scientists supporting climate change and 1 not supporting it, there will be a tendency to interview 1 from each camp and make it seem like there's an equal number out there on each side, you know, just because it makes it more fun as media, because media is, of course, entertainment as much as anything. And how important do you think that is, or how does one address that in trying to deal, especially with the things that are probably a lot less controversial than they seem?
I don't think it's a problem, and here's why. First of all, although most people disagree with me, I don't think this so-called media tendency to always seek an opposite opinion actually happens that much. There are tons, climate change would be an example. There are lots of articles that if an experiment is done that seems to support it, you just hear that, and you don't actually hear somebody saying, well, that experiment can't be right. Conversely, you know, an experiment done at CERN a few months ago seemed to suggest that cosmic rays could be an important role, play an important role. There wasn't, in the accounts I read, there wasn't a contradicting opinion. So that's one thing. Secondly, even if there is, my strong belief is people who believe this voice will continue, and they will see it there, and they'll say, of course, it's wrong. And the people that have the other point of view will see their view represented by a source that they trust, of course. And so you're nowhere. I think we should be moving to a point where the media, although that's a very awkward term, right, because it's so broad, should have the courage to have really strong points of view, not just on the op-ed page. But, you know, I don't think what you're talking about is a serious problem, because I see the media sort of feeding what these beliefs already are. And the real challenge is, how do you break down that very sort of traditional setup and try and challenge it in some way? Yep.
Thank you for the lecture. And I think looking at the problem on how you consider the scientific data is one way of looking at the problem. Has anything been done in the area of how to be critical about data which is not scientific? I mean, manipulated data or points of view that are not scientific?
I'm sure there has been, but not in this particular vein. So, and why, you know, I needed to focus this because you'd think that in a scientific controversy, the science would play an important role in the resolution of the controversy. And yet, it doesn't seem that that's the way it actually works. So in terms of data that really isn't scientific, I'm sure there's lots of work on that, but I don't know it offhand, and it isn't sort of germane. Nobody's done that with this.
Because on climate change, there's plenty of it. Arguments like false arguments trying to influence.
Well, you know, there are lots of false arguments made in the course of these controversies, and they come from, they are the result of the efforts of people who already have strongly held views to try and produce more and more evidence for their view. You know, there's too many examples, but if you want to look at, you know, take climate change, people are saying, okay, you know, the Greenland ice cap is going to melt in 10 years or 15 years or some such absurd number. I mean, those numbers do get thrown around. Well, they're not scientific. The IPCC had some examples, you know, the melting of the Himalayan glaciers and so on, that were actually bogus. But what can you do? You just, you have to know a lot to be able to identify those, and that's the problem because most people don't know a lot. Yes?
Hi. Yeah, the previous three speakers have managed to take all my questions. So
but you were in line anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the IPCC documents, there's thousands of pages. So the fact that there was only a few errors, like about the Himalaya things and typos and a few other things, it's kind of amazing that a document of thousands of pages has, you know, was so well done and there's so little wrong with it. My background is engineering and also physics. I'm a physicist, and I'm studying to be a climatologist, working on a PhD. So I just wanted to tell people that, you know, the public is going to get a shock very, very soon You know, the extreme weather, you can relate the melting sea ice in the Arctic, the increased warming, changing the jet streams, causing extreme weather, creating the ozone hole in the Arctic last year. And so look at the sea ice and look at the methane emissions that are rising there, because methane, the global warming potential is about 100 times greater on a short time scale, and it's bubbling up from the Arctic. Huge plumes, a kilometer in diameter versus 10 meters a few years ago. So I don't want to go and talk about all of that, but I'm just saying people are going to get a shock. Like,
well, then, you know, if people do get a shock, that might be the only way.
Right.
Do you have a question?
So the question is how do we change the political system so that it is not controlled by money, specifically money from fossil fuel companies? Because as we reach more scarcity with oil and gas, the prices go up higher, their profits go up higher, and a lot of them know about climate change, but they have they are funding the
so how do we change?
So
yes.
how do we break that? It was done 100 years ago with Standard Oil. They had a monopoly. It was broken by the government. How do we do that now?
Maybe we could elect a different government. No, I'm serious. I mean, what other way is there? You know, if people in this country don't like the apparent close association between the federal government and the oil companies, they should vote for somebody else. I think it's pretty straightforward. Yep.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm a computer scientist, and this is like my first time. Can I ask what percentage of U.S. population is Republican, roughly?
I don't know.
Now, may I assume it is close to 50%?
Yeah, maybe.
We see fluctuation of different parties. I find it difficult to believe, not that it's not right, that we have this specific different brain size and different functionality in 50% of the population and exactly in the other 50, the opposite.
Well, yeah.
So could it be the case that...
Yeah, but no, it's not like, okay, all of these Republicans have huge amygdalas. All these Democrats have tiny ones. You know, these are normal distributions, but slightly skewed so that, you know, that there's a preponderance. So, and like these studies are done on 50 people. So I don't want to pretend that this is like biblical truth or anything, but if they hold up, an unfortunate reference perhaps. But nonetheless, it could be possible that if you look at 1,000 Republicans and 1,000 Democrats, there is a slightly different mean.
Basically, what I'm suggesting is perhaps that people choose their parties according to the place and environments that they get exposed to. These things happen to their brain, so it's a side effect.
Okay, but so here I'll throw out another thing for you that on average, a person's political affiliation in the U.S. is 70% predictable by what their parents are. Okay, Republican, Democrat. I don't know what happens if you have one parent or the other. You can't decide. Vote for Ralph Nader. But you can predict with 80% accuracy from some of the data from these brains by looking at brains. And brains in fMRI and things like what brains do. You can predict with greater accuracy than what has been the gold standard up till now. So, you know, how you explain that, and I should point out, we don't even know, do the values come first and the brain structure second, or vice versa? Brain structure determines value, you know, because the brain's plastic. You know, London cab drivers have huge hippocampuses because they have to know their way around the city of London, and that's an organ in the brain that we use for route finding and dead reckoning. So, anyway, yep, yes, okay. Come on, people, I'm getting old. I can't stay up all night.
Mine's quick, I promise. I just, I noticed that there are a
It's
lot
the
more...
answers that I'm worried about, not the question.
It'll be quick, too.
Okay.
I just noticed that there were a lot more men asking questions, so I felt the need to come up here and ask.
I always just assume that women already understand everything.
You know what? Forget my question. No, my question is just, what role does gender play in confirmation bias?
No studies have been done that I'm aware of. There probably, or gender was accounted for but not, had no huge impact on the results. So as far as I know. It's an interesting question though. I actually got to say I love this because this research, because it's just unfolding, raises many of the questions that people have asked. And I'm in the sort of position where I have to wait for these people to do the studies, right? So, and they're not forthcoming quite as quickly as I would like, because I'm particularly interested in this whole business of how do you communicate science effectively when there's a controversy on values being, whether it's infested with values. It's a tough question. I have to stop now. Okay, yeah. All right. What if this is the last? What if this is the last question?
It will be.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Okay. I was sort of wondering if we actually want consensus on controversial issues, or whether having a breadth of outlooks in various aspects of life could actually be a good thing, and thus, if there's going to be different views that are going to be held, whether having better techniques of persuading people or trying to convince people of an argument, knowing, for instance, whether giving them the same information from a different source might help persuade them, whether trying to inform large groups of people all in the same direction. I mean, and in fact, I definitely liked your, well, did you say try this search engine?
Yeah, Don't forget, that was my idea.
I would switch to that one instantly. But yeah, do we want to reach consensus?
Yeah, okay, so there's two parts to this answer. One is I totally agree with you that hearing and paying attention to diversity of opinion is hugely important. But at some point you have to make decisions. And in the case of most of the controversies I mentioned tonight, you do have to finally decide, are we going to do something about this or are we not? And if so, what are we going to do? And so to get there, you at least in a democratic society have to have a majority opinion. And if opinions are all over the map and you're paralyzed by that diversity, in some important cases, that's a bad thing. I agree with you. Like, propagandizing is not something that you want to do, but you have to move forward, and you have to have decisions have to be taken. So where there's, and especially if what is creating the controversy is scientific data, then you need to find some way of distributing that scientific data to the public in a way that a decision can be made.
I suppose that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jay, for that great talk. That's, I think on the airplane now, when they've run out of my favorite newspaper, I'll grab the other one a little more enthusiastically now. So we're really grateful for your talk tonight. I want to thank all of you as well for the great questions and enthusiasm with which you received the talk. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We'd like to present you with a small token from your time here, a plaque copy of the poster from your talk to mount on the wall, and we will have one mounted in the faculty as well.
Try This is going to have this logo.
So thank you again.